Now let's turn to Job chapter 35 verses 1 to 8. Moreover Elihu answered and said, Do you think this is right? Do you say, My righteousness is more than God's? For you say, What advantage will it be to you? What profit shall I have, more than if I had sinned? I will answer you, and your companions with you. Look to the heavens and see, and behold the clouds, they are higher than you. If you sin, what do you accomplish against him? Or, if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects a man such as you, and your righteousness a son of man.
Author's intent. Elihu challenges Job's implicit claim that righteousness should guarantee divine response. The author portrays Elihu as making a crucial theological point about divine transcendence, that God's greatness means human actions, whether righteous or wicked, do not affect God's essential nature or well-being. This argument serves to correct Job's apparent assumption that God owes him an explanation. Original audience understanding. Ancient Near Eastern audiences would recognize this as addressing a common misconception about divine-human relationships. In a world where gods were often viewed as needing human worship and service, Elihu's argument would be revolutionary, asserting that the true God is self-sufficient and not dependent on human moral performance for his happiness or completion. Universal application. This passage teaches that God's love and justice are not contingent upon what he gains from us. Our righteousness doesn't make God better, nor does our sin diminish his glory. This liberates believers from transactional thinking about faith and establishes that God's motivation for relationship stems from his nature, not his needs.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 35 verses 9 to 13. Because of the multitude of oppressions they cry out. They cry out for help because of the arm of the mighty. But no one says, Where is God my Maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth, and makes us wiser than the birds of heaven? There they cry out, but he does not answer, because of the pride of evil men. Surely God will not listen to empty talk, nor will the Almighty regard it.
Author's intent. The author uses Elihu to explain why prayers sometimes seem unanswered. The distinction between crying out from oppression versus seeking God himself addresses the quality and motivation of prayer. Elihu suggests that mere suffering doesn't automatically warrant divine intervention. The heart's posture matters more than circumstances. Original audience understanding. In an era where immediate divine response to crisis was often expected, this teaching would challenge conventional wisdom. The original hearers would understand this as explaining why the righteous sometimes suffer without apparent divine intervention. It's not always about God's absence but about the nature of authentic seeking. Universal application. This passage provides crucial insight into prayer and divine silence. It distinguishes between demanding God solve our problems versus truly seeking God himself in our trials. When prayers seem unanswered, believers are called to examine not just their circumstances but their heart's true orientation toward God.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 35 verses 14 to 16. Although you say you do not see him, yet justice is before him, and you must wait for him. And now, because he has not punished in his anger, nor taken much notice of folly, therefore Job opens his mouth in vain, he multiplies words without knowledge.
Author's intent. Elihu criticizes Job's approach to waiting for God's response, suggesting Job's waiting contains presumption and impatience. The author portrays this as a final warning before God himself speaks. Elihu recognizes that Job's case is beyond human wisdom but cautions against Job's demanding posture. Original audience understanding. The original audience would see this as preparation for divine intervention. Elihu's acknowledgement that the case awaits divine judgment while criticizing Job's presumptuous attitude would signal to hearers that God's own voice is about to break the deadlock. Universal application. This teaches believers about proper posture while waiting for God's response to suffering. Faithful waiting involves trust and humility rather than demands and timelines. The passage warns against presuming to know when or how God should act while affirming that ultimate answers come from God alone.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 36 verses 1 to 12. Elihu also proceeded and said, "Bear with me a little, and I will show you that there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar. I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Behold, God is mighty, but despises no one. He is mighty in strength of understanding. He does not preserve the life of the wicked, but gives justice to the oppressed. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but they are on the throne with kings, for he has seated them forever, and they are exalted. And if they are bound in fetters, held in the cords of affliction, then he tells them their work and their transgressions, that they have acted defiantly. He also opens their ear to instruction, and commands that they turn from iniquity. If they obey and serve him, they shall spend their days in prosperity, and their years in pleasures. But if they do not obey, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge."
Author's intent. The author presents Elihu's most mature theological insight, that suffering can serve as divine pedagogy. This revolutionary concept suggests God uses affliction not just as punishment but as instruction, opening the ear to receive wisdom that prosperity might never teach. The author shows suffering can be redemptive when received with humility. Original audience understanding. Ancient audiences typically viewed suffering as purely punitive or random. Elihu's teaching that God might use suffering educationally would challenge conventional wisdom. The concept that God opens their ear by oppression would introduce a new framework for understanding divine purpose in human pain. Universal application. This passage provides crucial theodicy, explaining how suffering can serve God's good purposes without God being the author of evil. Believers learn that trials can be divine classrooms where spiritual growth occurs in ways impossible during comfortable seasons. The key is responding with teachable hearts rather than defensive resistance.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 36 verses 13 to 21. But the hypocrites in heart store up wrath. They do not cry for help when he binds them. They die in youth, and their life ends among the perverted persons. He delivers the poor in their affliction, and opens their ears in oppression. Indeed, he would have brought you out of dire distress, into a broad place where there is no restraint, and what is set on your table would be full of richness. But you are filled with the judgment due the wicked, judgment and justice take hold of you. Because there is wrath, beware lest he take you away with one blow, for a large ransom would not help you avoid it. Will your riches, or all the mighty forces, keep you from distress? Do not desire the night, when people are cut off in their place. Take heed, do not turn to iniquity, for you have chosen this rather than affliction.
Author's intent. The author contrasts two responses to divine discipline through Elihu's words. The godless become bitter and die young spiritually, while the afflicted find deliverance through learning. This shows that the same suffering can produce opposite results depending on heart response, either increased rebellion or deeper devotion. Original audience understanding. The original hearers would understand this as explaining why some people emerge from suffering better while others become worse. The warning about adding rebellion to sin would resonate with those who had witnessed how trials either refine or embitter people. Universal application. This passage teaches that suffering's ultimate impact depends on our response to it. Bitterness and blame lead to spiritual death, while humble reception of divine discipline leads to deliverance and growth. Believers are warned against letting pain produce rebellion and encouraged to seek God's purposes in their trials.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 36 verses 22 to 33. Behold, God is exalted by his power. Who teaches like him? Who has assigned him his way, or who has said, "You have done wrong"? Remember to magnify his work, of which men have sung. Everyone has seen it. Man looks on it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we do not know him, nor can the number of his years be discovered. For he draws up drops of water, which distill as rain from the mist, which the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man. Indeed, can anyone understand the spreading of clouds, the thunder from his canopy? Look, he scatters his light upon it, and covers the depths of the sea. For by these he judges the peoples, he gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with lightning, and commands it to strike. His thunder declares it, the cattle also, concerning the rising storm.
Author's intent. Elihu transitions to natural theology, using God's power in weather and natural phenomena as evidence of his wisdom and justice. The author prepares for God's speeches by establishing that divine power visible in nature reflects God's moral government. The same God who controls storms also governs human affairs with perfect justice. Original audience understanding. Ancient peoples were intimately familiar with weather's power and unpredictability. Elihu's use of natural phenomena as theological illustration would powerfully communicate God's sovereignty. The imagery of God's voice and thunder would prepare them for the divine speeches to follow. Universal application. This passage teaches that general revelation through nature provides evidence of God's attributes. The same power that governs natural forces governs human destiny. Believers should see in nature's majesty a reflection of God's moral majesty, finding confidence that the God powerful enough to control storms is wise enough to govern their lives.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 37 verses 1 to 13. At this also my heart trembles, and leaps from its place. Hear attentively the thunder of his voice, and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. He sends it forth under the whole heaven, his lightning to the ends of the earth. After it a voice roars, he thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain them when his voice is heard. God thunders marvelously with his voice. He does great things which we cannot comprehend. For he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of his strength. He seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work. The beasts go into dens, and remain in their lairs. From the chamber of the south comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds of the north. By the breath of God ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen. Also with moisture he saturates the thick clouds, he scatters his bright clouds. And they swirl about, being turned by his guidance, that they may do whatever he commands them on the face of the whole earth. He causes it to come, whether for correction, or for his land, or for mercy.
Author's intent. Elihu describes his physical and emotional response to thunder as God's voice, modeling appropriate human response to divine majesty. The author uses this to prepare readers for God's imminent speaking. When the Almighty breaks his silence, the proper response is reverential awe, not demanding answers. Original audience understanding. Ancient Near Eastern peoples regularly experienced thunderstorms as manifestations of divine power. Elihu's description of trembling at God's voice would resonate deeply, preparing them to understand that divine communication evokes awe rather than casual conversation. Universal application. This passage teaches proper disposition when approaching God. Whether in prayer, worship, or seeking answers to life's questions, believers should approach with reverential awe. The heart that trembles at God's voice recognizes the vast distinction between creator and creature, maintaining humility even when seeking understanding.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 37 verses 14 to 20. Listen to this, O Job. Stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know when God dispatches them, and causes the light of his cloud to shine? Do you know how the clouds are balanced, those wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? Why are your garments hot, when he quiets the earth by the south wind? With him, have you spread out the skies, strong as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we should say to him, for we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. Should he be told that I wish to speak? If a man were to speak, surely he would be swallowed up.
Author's intent. Elihu directly addresses Job, calling him to stand still and consider God's wondrous works. The author emphasizes human ignorance regarding divine operations. We cannot even understand how clouds are balanced, much less comprehend God's purposes in human suffering. Original audience understanding. The original audience would recognize this as a final appeal before divine intervention. The call to stand still would prepare them for contemplative rather than argumentative postures. The rhetorical questions about natural phenomena would humble human presumption about understanding divine ways. Universal application. This passage calls believers to contemplative faith rather than demanding explanations. When facing incomprehensible circumstances, the appropriate response is wonder and worship rather than accusations and demands. True wisdom begins with acknowledging the limitations of human understanding.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 37 verses 21 to 24. Even now men cannot look at the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. He comes from the north as golden splendor, with God as awesome majesty. As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power, in judgment and abundant justice. He does not oppress. Therefore men fear him. He shows no partiality to any who are wise of heart.
Author's intent. Elihu concludes by describing God's absolute majesty and perfect justice, acknowledging that God is beyond human approach or manipulation. The author establishes that the coming divine revelation will be pure grace. God cannot be summoned or controlled but chooses to reveal himself. Original audience understanding. The imagery of unapproachable light would convey God's absolute transcendence to the original hearers. The affirmation that God does not oppress would prepare them to receive his coming words as just and good, even if difficult to understand. Universal application. This passage establishes that divine revelation is always grace, never entitlement. God's decision to speak to human beings stems from his goodness, not his obligation. Believers approach God knowing that any communication from him is gift, not right, producing gratitude rather than presumption.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 38 verses 1 to 15. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and said, Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors, when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band? When I fixed my limit for it, and set bars and doors? When I said, This far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It takes on form like clay under a seal, and stands out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the upraised arm is broken.
Author's intent. God's opening words establish the proper relationship between creator and creature. By questioning Job about creation's foundations and cosmic boundaries, the author shows that finite beings cannot comprehend infinite purposes. The rhetorical questions are not meant to humiliate but to restore proper perspective. Original audience understanding. Ancient cosmologies often depicted chaotic creation processes, but God's description emphasizes intentional design and joyful celebration. The morning stars sang together would convey to original hearers that creation was harmonious and purposeful, not accidental or conflicted. Universal application. This passage teaches that questioning God's justice requires first understanding his nature and capabilities. Before demanding explanations for suffering, believers must acknowledge the vast difference between human limitations and divine wisdom. The questions probe not Job's intelligence but his perspective.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 38 verses 16 to 30. Have you entered the springs of the sea? Or have you walked in search of the depths? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me, if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place, that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home? Do you know it, because you were born then, or because the number of your days is great? Have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered over the earth? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste, and cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass? Has the rain a father? Or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice? And the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen.
Author's intent. God's questions move from Earth's foundations to its extremes, ocean depths, death's realm, and cosmic phenomena. The author demonstrates that human experience covers only a tiny fraction of reality. If Job cannot comprehend these visible mysteries, how can he judge invisible divine purposes? Original audience understanding. Ancient peoples viewed the sea depths and stellar patterns as particularly mysterious and powerful. God's claim to understand and control these realms would establish his absolute authority over all reality, including the moral realm where Job's questions arise. Universal application. This passage humbles human presumption about understanding divine purposes. The same God who governs physical mysteries also governs moral mysteries. Believers learn that trusting God's goodness doesn't require understanding his methods, since his wisdom extends far beyond human comprehension.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 38 verses 31 to 41. Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion? Can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season? Or can you guide the great bear with its cubs? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water may cover you? Can you send out lightnings, that they may go, and say to you, Here we are? Who has put wisdom in the mind? Or who has given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven, when the dust hardens in clumps, and the clods cling together? Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions, when they crouch in their dens, or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait? Who provides food for the raven, when its young ones cry to God, and wander about for lack of food?
Author's intent. God's questions about stellar patterns and animal care demonstrate his active governance of all creation. The author shows that divine attention extends from cosmic to personal. The same God who guides constellations also provides for ravens, combining majesty with intimate care. Original audience understanding. The original audience would recognize these questions as establishing God's comprehensive sovereignty. The combination of astronomical and zoological examples would demonstrate that nothing in creation operates independently of divine oversight and provision. Universal application. This passage assures believers that the God powerful enough to govern galaxies is attentive enough to care for individual creatures. Divine majesty doesn't distance God from personal concern but enhances it. The same wisdom governing cosmic order governs personal circumstances with perfect care.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 39 verses 1 to 12. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bear young? They bow down, they bring forth their young, they deliver their offspring. Their young ones are healthy, they grow strong with grain, they depart and do not return to them. Who set the wild donkey free? Who loosed the bonds of the onager, whose home I have made the wilderness, and the barren land his dwelling? He scorns the tumult of the city, he does not heed the shouts of the driver. The range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes? Or will he plow the valleys behind you? Will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? Will you trust him to bring home your grain, and gather it to your threshing floor?
Author's intent. God describes wild animals that operate outside human control or understanding. The author uses these examples to show that divine purposes often involve freedom and wildness that human neat categories cannot contain. God delights in creatures that serve no obvious human purpose. Original audience understanding. Ancient agricultural societies would understand the contrast between domesticated and wild animals. God's celebration of wildness would challenge assumptions that all of creation should serve human convenience or understanding. Universal application. This passage teaches that God's purposes include elements beyond human control or comprehension. Just as God delights in wild creatures that serve his purposes rather than human convenience, his governance of human affairs may involve elements that don't fit our expectations or desires.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 39 verses 13 to 25. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly stork's? For she leaves her eggs on the ground, and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain, without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom, and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. Have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. He paws in the valley, and rejoices in his strength. He gallops into the clash of arms. He mocks at fear, and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and javelin. He devours the distance with fierceness and rage, nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sounded. At the blast of the trumpet he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of captains and shouting.
Author's intent. The author presents the ostrich as seemingly foolish yet successful, demonstrating that divine wisdom sometimes appears as foolishness to human observation. The warhorse's eager courage illustrates that God creates beings with passionate purposes that transcend mere survival. Original audience understanding. The original hearers would recognize these as paradoxes in creation, creatures that seem poorly designed yet thrive. This would challenge their assumptions about divine wisdom always being obviously rational to human minds. Universal application. This passage teaches that God's wisdom often appears foolish to human judgment. Divine purposes may involve apparent inefficiencies or contradictions that serve larger purposes beyond human understanding. Believers learn to trust divine wisdom even when it contradicts human logic.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 39 verses 26 to 30. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom, and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command, and make its nest on high? On the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock and the stronghold. From there it spies out the prey, its eyes observe from afar. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is.
Author's intent. God concludes with birds of prey that soar to unreachable heights and possess vision far superior to human sight. The author uses these creatures to demonstrate that divine perspective operates from heights and with clarity impossible for earth-bound humans. Original audience understanding. Ancient peoples would marvel at eagles' soaring abilities and hunting precision. These examples would communicate that divine perspective operates from vantage points and with acuity that human beings cannot achieve or even imagine. Universal application. This passage teaches that divine perspective operates from heights and with clarity unavailable to human viewpoint. What appears confusing or unjust from human perspective may be perfectly clear and purposeful from divine perspective. Believers are called to trust the divine viewpoint even when their own vision is limited.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 40 verses 1 to 5. Moreover the Lord answered Job, and said, Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further.
Author's intent. The author shows Job's recognition that he has overstepped proper boundaries in his accusations against God. Job's hand over his mouth symbolizes the end of human argumentation when confronted with divine reality. This isn't defeat but enlightenment. Job sees the futility of finite beings correcting infinite wisdom. Original audience understanding. Ancient legal contexts would recognize this as the moment when a defendant realizes the hopelessness of their case. Job's silence wouldn't indicate guilt but recognition of the vast disparity between human and divine understanding. Universal application. This passage teaches the appropriate response when divine perspective challenges human judgment. True wisdom involves recognizing when to cease argumentation and submit to superior wisdom. Believers learn that silence before God often indicates growth rather than defeat.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 40 verses 6 to 14. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and said, Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? Or can you thunder with a voice like his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor, and array yourself with glory and beauty. Disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who is proud, and humble him. Look on everyone who is proud, and bring him low, tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, bind their faces in hidden darkness. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you.
Author's intent. God challenges Job to take over divine governance. If Job can rule the world better, he should attempt it. The author uses this impossible challenge to demonstrate that criticism of divine government requires ability to provide superior alternatives, which no human possesses. Original audience understanding. The original audience would understand this as the ultimate challenge to human presumption. The imagery of governmental authority would resonate with peoples familiar with the complexities of human rule, making divine governance appear infinitely more complex. Universal application. This passage teaches that criticism of God's governance requires willingness to assume responsibility for superior alternatives. Before questioning divine justice, believers should consider whether they could govern creation more justly. The challenge reveals human inadequacy for divine responsibilities.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 40 verses 15 to 24. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God, only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees, in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade, the willows by the brook surround him. Indeed the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare.
Author's intent. God introduces Behemoth, a creature of immense power that only its creator can approach safely. The author uses this creature to represent forces in creation that dwarf human power and resist human control, demonstrating that God governs powers beyond human comprehension or management. Original audience understanding. Whether representing a hippopotamus, elephant, or mythical creature, the original audience would recognize Behemoth as embodying untamable natural power. This would illustrate God's authority over forces that humans can neither control nor fully understand. Universal application. This passage teaches that God governs forces beyond human ability to control or comprehend. Just as only God can safely approach Behemoth, only God can manage the powerful forces that shape human destiny. Believers learn to trust divine control over uncontrollable circumstances.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 41 verses 1 to 11. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle, never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me, that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine.
Author's intent. God describes Leviathan as completely beyond human control or negotiation. The author uses this creature to represent chaos forces that only divine power can govern. The rhetorical questions about capturing or bargaining with Leviathan demonstrate human helplessness before ultimate powers. Original audience understanding. Ancient Near Eastern audiences would recognize Leviathan from mythological traditions as a chaos monster representing forces opposing divine order. God's mastery over Leviathan would demonstrate his supremacy over all potentially destructive powers. Universal application. This passage teaches that forces of chaos and destruction that threaten human security are under divine control. What appears overwhelmingly threatening to human beings remains subject to divine authority. Believers find security knowing that even chaotic forces serve divine purposes.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 41 verses 12 to 24. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face, with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another, they stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone.
Author's intent. God's detailed description of Leviathan's impenetrable armor and fierce appearance emphasizes that this creature is invulnerable to human attack. The author demonstrates that some realities in creation are completely beyond human ability to challenge or change. Original audience understanding. The military imagery would resonate with audiences familiar with warfare and armor. Leviathan's invincibility would represent ultimate power that human strength cannot overcome, making divine mastery over such force appear even more impressive. Universal application. This passage teaches that some challenges in life are completely beyond human ability to overcome through effort or strategy. Rather than encouraging despair, it points to divine authority over seemingly invincible problems. Believers learn to depend on divine power when facing insurmountable difficulties.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 41 verses 25 to 34. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Slingstones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. On earth there is nothing like him, which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride.
Author's intent. God concludes by describing Leviathan as king over all proud creatures, fearing nothing and ruling through pure dominance. The author uses this to represent ultimate earthly power and pride that only divine authority can humble or govern. Original audience understanding. The original hearers would understand Leviathan as representing the pinnacle of earthly power and pride. Its description as king over all the children of pride would identify it with human arrogance that considers itself accountable to no higher authority. Universal application. This passage teaches that even the greatest earthly powers and proudest human achievements remain subject to divine sovereignty. What appears invincible from human perspective, whether personal, political, or spiritual powers, remains under God's ultimate authority. Believers find courage knowing that no earthly power can ultimately prevail against divine purposes.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 42 verses 1 to 6. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes.
Author's intent. The author presents Job's transformation through divine encounter. Job's repentance isn't for specific sins but for presuming to understand divine purposes beyond his capacity. His seeing God represents experiential knowledge that transforms perspective, moving from theoretical to personal understanding of divine character. Original audience understanding. Ancient audiences would recognize this as the proper response to divine theophany. Job's dust and ashes would symbolize complete humility before ultimate reality. The contrast between hearing and seeing would communicate the difference between second-hand and first-hand knowledge of God. Universal application. This passage teaches that authentic encounter with God produces humility rather than vindication. True spiritual growth involves recognizing the limitations of human understanding while growing in personal knowledge of divine character. Believers learn that repentance sometimes means releasing demands for explanations rather than confessing specific wrongdoing.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 42 verses 7 to 9. And so it was, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore, take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord commanded them, for the Lord had accepted Job.
Author's intent. The author reveals God's assessment of the debates. Job spoke rightly about God while his friends did not. This vindication doesn't mean Job was perfect but that his honest questioning was more acceptable than false certainty. Job's role as intercessor demonstrates restoration to spiritual leadership. Original audience understanding. The original hearers would understand this as divine judgment on different approaches to theodicy. God's preference for Job's honest struggle over his friend's simplistic answers would challenge conventional wisdom about proper religious response to suffering. Universal application. This passage teaches that honest questioning is more pleasing to God than false certainty or simplistic answers. God values authentic relationship over correct doctrine when doctrine lacks compassion. Believers learn that struggling with faith honestly is more acceptable than pretending to understand what they don't.
Now let's turn to Job chapter 42 verses 10 to 17. And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then all his brothers, all his sisters, and all those who had been his acquaintances before, came to him and ate food with him in his house. And they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. Each one gave him a piece of silver and each a ring of gold. Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first Jemimah, the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Hapach. In all the land were found no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. After this Job lived 140 years, and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died, old and full of days.
Author's intent. The author concludes with material and familial restoration that exceeds Job's original state. The doubling of possessions while maintaining the same number of children suggests that the original children aren't truly lost but await reunion. This demonstrates that faithfulness through suffering leads to blessing beyond the original state. Original audience understanding. Ancient audiences would see this as divine vindication of Job's faithfulness and proof that God doesn't abandon those who remain faithful through inexplicable suffering. The restoration would encourage others facing similar trials to maintain faith despite temporary appearances. Universal application. This passage teaches that God's ultimate purposes involve restoration and blessing for those who remain faithful through suffering. While restoration may not always be material or immediate, God's faithfulness ensures that no suffering endured in faith is ultimately wasted. Believers are encouraged to trust long-term divine purposes even when short-term circumstances suggest divine abandonment. Theological synthesis. The book of Job's conclusion demonstrates that the problem of suffering finds its resolution not in philosophical explanation but in personal encounter with the divine character. The text teaches that God's purposes transcend human understanding while his character remains trustworthy. Protestant theology emphasizes that faith involves trusting divine goodness even when divine methods remain mysterious, preparing believers for ultimate resolution in eschatological restoration while finding meaning in present relationship with God through suffering. Theological synthesis. The book of Job's conclusion demonstrates that the problem of suffering finds its resolution not in philosophical explanation but in personal encounter with the divine character. The text teaches that God's purposes transcend human understanding while his character remains trustworthy. Protestant theology emphasizes that faith involves trusting divine goodness even when divine methods remain mysterious, preparing believers for ultimate resolution in eschatological restoration while finding meaning in present relationship with God through suffering.